Hello. Today's message is based on the passage found in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52, and it reads, "Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowds. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, 'Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid.' Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." Matthew's version of this story is more popular, and it may be the one that you're most accustomed to. It's the one that has Peter walking out on the water, which is, in many ways, relatable. Many of us are faced with those moments when we are challenged to step out of a metaphorical boat in faith onto very unstable, unsettling ground, as unstable and as unsettling as those choppy waters. And Peter loses his footing, as we so often do, but then discovers that there is grace for him still, but that's another sermon. This week, we are considering the story as told in Mark's gospel. And as is true in the other tellings, this story is placed just after Jesus has fed the multitudes with the loaves and the fish. And last week's message covered this, how God's people possess all that they need to change the world. We talked about how the story teaches us that when resources seem scarce, it does no good to lament what we lack. Rather, we take what we've got and put it to work to try to change the world as God intends. 5 loaves and 2 fish fed 5,000. Who knows what will happen when we take what we've got and trust that by God's grace, it will be enough. I only bring it up because Mark ties today's story about the disciples' fear on the water with the feeding of the 5,000. The line, "and they were utterly astounded," verse 51, and then verse 52, "for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." That line grabs my attention, as well it should. It functions as the punchline in Mark's telling of the story. It's the line that is meant to make you stop and think about what you've just heard. And the implications are obvious. If the significance of what they just witnessed in the feeding of the 5,000 had sunk in, then things would have been different when the wind threatened them and almost swamped their boat. In fact, if you read the story carefully, it turns out that Jesus was so confident that they would have understood what they had just seen in the feeding of the 5,000, that it was his intention to pass right by them. The text reads, "When he saw that they were straining at the oars against the adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by." It's as if he's thinking, yeah, they've got this. They know. They've seen, they've witnessed amazing things. They'll be fine. And this turned out not to be the case. It works like this. I'll tell it from my own vantage point. I left last week's sermon where I preached a high-minded sermon, one that I believe in and still believe in, to be sure, but high-minded nonetheless. I really went for it. And it wasn't because I was being ambitious. It was what the story teaches, that there is more than meets the eye to our circumstance, that when we take what little we have, it multiplies, and we discover that there is more than enough to go around in many circumstances where we believe that that was not the case. So I said in confidence that we have everything that we need, enough to go around, was in fact the sermon title. Then I stepped away from the pulpit in the moment when Jesus broke bread, and that moment immediately seemed a hazier memory. When I stepped into the boat, metaphorically speaking, my life's boat, and sailed out into the seas of life, the wind was every bit as pressing as it was before I came to church. The waves every bit as intimidating. My own seeming precarious place in the world overwhelmed me as it sometimes does. And at times, it turns out that it's as if I am right there in the boat with the disciples. Turns out that in those moments, I myself, as soon as I leave the story, do not understand about the loaves. When disciples do not understand about the miracle of the loaves and the fish, we are like the Israelites freed from Egypt, but still enthralled by our impotency, the impotency of our holy imaginations. Our spiritual sight that ought to see more has been trained to see more by life's experiences, and yet we forget. As I said, I left the pulpit last Sunday and immediately forgot about the miracle I had just believed in moments before and had testified to. I joined the disciples in their lack of faith when I did not understand about the loaves. For if I had, I would know that even in the midst of life's storms, the power implied in the miracle of the loaves and the fish is alive and active in the world. I would know that the God who has called me out into the sea is still with me, and that undreamt of possibilities persist just beneath the surface of the waters that seem impossible to navigate. I would know that if I could remember about the miracle of the loaves. This is why I like the telling of this story from Mark's perspective and how it links what happens in the wind-tossed boat with what happened just before when Jesus multiplied the bread and the fish. The Holy Spirit knows that as soon as we step away from those encounters, we'll forget what we saw there. The disciples did, and our hearts are just as hard and just as impenetrable than theirs. This is the reality. This is who we are. This is humanity. So why do we lose heart? Why do we fail to carry the memory of God's faithfulness with us into the storms of life? Why do we stop believing in God's providence for us the second that we step away from the hillside encounter with Jesus? I think it's because the implications are just too overwhelming to consider if we could muster the faith to believe that God is that faithful, that there is enough to go around. When Kelly told me that she was pregnant with our third child, Abel, the encounter went something like this. I said, "You're kidding." I could not believe in this new reality that I was being faced with. So I said, "You're kidding." She said, "No, I'm not." "No," I said. "Still no. Can't believe it." "Yes," she said. "Show me," I said. Now, she showed me the pregnancy test, the double lines, proof that I could see with my eyes and hold with my hands. Yet still I was incredulous and strongly tempted to discount what I had seen with my own eyes, the wonderful and astonishing and terrifying news that I had heard and what I had seen with my own eyes. Too terrible and wonderful to contemplate at the same time. When Jesus revealed the power in God in his resurrection, and the women returned from the tomb to tell the story, it could be read in a similar way. Basically, "You're kidding," said the disciples. The women who had seen the risen Lord said, "No, we're not." "No," they said. "Yes, it's true," they said. "Show me," the disciples said. They could not believe, dared not believe the terrible, wonderful news. Now, in time, they learned it to be true. But you can understand why the prospect of believing what is good news beyond a reasonable hope is frightening, right? So we fail to understand about the loaves, the resurrection, the life that is in Jesus, all of it. And our hearts are hardened, mine, yours, and nearly everyone that we know. We refuse to see what is simply too good to be true. Now, why is that? Biblical commentator and interpreter, scholar David Loaves breaks down our tendency to harden our hearts to these astonishing claims. And he does so as follows, and I'm quoting, "But hardened against what?" The question at hand is how he begins this quote. "But hardened against what?" Again, we can't say for sure, but I have a hunch it's against the sheer possibility that Jesus represents. Perhaps they figure that some things are just the way they are, and there's nothing you can do about it. When there's not enough food, there's just not enough. When the wind is blowing the wrong way, there's no going against it. When you walk onto water, you sink. How do we know? Because it's always been this way and always will. Except that when Jesus is around, it's not. When Jesus is around, anything can happen, and often does. That's got to be a little unnerving. The sheer possibility that Jesus represents unsettles things, shakes things up, makes you wonder what you can count on. And given that the disciples, probably no less than we, liked some measure of stability, some modicum of control over their world, or at least some sense that they could count on the laws of the world as they understood them holding true, they may have found all the haywire and unpredictable events that happened with Jesus a little too much to handle. And so they hardened their hearts to the extraordinary and hugged the mundane. They refused to see the miraculous and clung to the predictable, safer that way. But oh, how limiting, writes David Loaves. Oh, how limiting, boring, and ultimately deadening. True, it may be safer to discount the miraculous, the wonderful, the astonishing good news of the gospel of Jesus. Safer in that it doesn't challenge us towards a reckless hope that would break your heart if it were not true. And yet, how limiting, boring, and ultimately deadening. It is a good thing that the disciples would eventually see it for what it was. The result is history. What happened next was the ascendancy of the Christian church, born out of a faith in the incredible and the highest hopes for humanity. This is the faith that will build our church today. This is the faith that will build our church today. Please understand about the loaves, the resurrective power of Jesus, all of it. Understand, or if not understand, live as if it were true, in faith and in hope and in great expectation. The power of God has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ, who calls us out onto the waters, not in fear, but in faith. Those who have seen the loaves multiplied, who have borne witness to the power in God that calls us forward, testify to the wisdom behind the reassuring words Jesus shared with the disciples on the waters. take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. Let those words echo over the waters and through the centuries. Northwood Christian Church, take heart. Christ is with us. Do not be afraid. The ones who minister to the needs of thousands is with us still, in our midst, in us, and working through us. We must never forget this. We must never forget the ways God has been with us so far. We must resist the temptation to be made jaded and cynical as the realities of this world press in around us. Our hearts become hard at the potential in Christ at our peril. We must try to understand about the miracle of the loaves.